Azure that which will help us to go and provision and then use the Azure infrastructure. Now here is a small diagram which will help us to understand what exactly is there behind the scenes. And of course, you go and get into your Azure portal and you start deploying the resources, maybe anything like your storage or your virtual machine or a network uh, related stuff, whatever it is. So when you get into the virtual machine and when you get into the portal and start deploying the things, now we need to understand what are those things that which will or which are running at the back end so that you are getting your tasks done. Right, so Azure at the back end has got certain components, right? So to understand it, they have got a virtualization solution behind the cloud layer. So what is that virtualization solution? So it is an hypervisor, right? So we all understood, we all know that there is a physical server. On top of it, you put a small piece of software, which we call it as hypervisor, which creates that virtual world where you can host multiple, what do you call it as virtual machines. So behind the scenes, your cloud infrastructure, any cloud infrastructure, more in specific what we are talking in Azure, we have a virtualization environment. Now that virtualization environment runs on Microsoft hypervisor, which is called as Hyper-V. Now what we need to understand here is you have a bunch of racks, right? These are all small boxes, one on top of the other. So these boxes, or you can compare them or you can visualize them as a physical servers. On top of these physical servers, you have a piece of software which we call it as hypervisor. Now these servers are interconnected to each other using a network switch, right? So like how you do it in your production environment on premises, right? The same way. So the Azure backend environment is nothing but a bunch of servers with an hypervisor on top of it. And these group of servers are clustered and they are categorized into racks, right? So you can see the fabric controller, below that you see a bunch of servers here. They are part of one rack. Similarly, there's another rack, on top of it you have a fabric controller. Now a bunch of servers interconnected to each other and a fabric controller sitting on top of it, and that fabric controller will communicate to another piece of software called as orchestrator. Now let us try to understand what is this fabric controller first of all. So we understood that at the back end, we have a bunch of servers with a hypervisor on top of it. But how does your Azure know that whether a server is capable of accepting additional load or not, or whether the server is active or not, or whether there is a problem on that? So your fabric controller is a piece of software which sits on top of your, what do you call it as a hypervisor, and which will know the state of your servers. And whenever there is a request that comes to it to deploy any resource, it will take a call where exactly that particular request should go. Right now, that is fabric controller. Now from where the fabric controller will get those requests, it will get from another piece of software called as orchestrator. Now what is an orchestrator? An orchestrator is a front end to you as a user, right? If you're a user who logged into the Azure portal, you deploy or you initiate a command to kind of provision a VM, then what's happening, your request will go to your orchestrator, and orchestrator in turn sends that particular request to your fabric controller. Now then the fabric controller will go and validate, okay, so this is the server where I can go and push this request, and then once the activity is done, it reverses back to your orchestrator, and which will be in turn visible to you within the portal, which says your machine is deployed successfully or there is a failure. Right? So that's how your Azure will work. Guys, whoever are not speaking, I would request you to please go on mute. Thank you. Right, so that's how your Azure environment will work. Okay, so the small video, let us try to kind of see that, so that we understand things in a more more meaningful way, right? Let me quickly share the video, which is from Microsoft itself. Hope you guys will be able to listen to the video.
Microsoft Azure is a private and public cloud platform. You may be familiar with the Azure services that developers and IT professionals use to build, deploy, and manage applications. But how does it work? Azure uses a technology known as virtualization. Virtualization separates the tight coupling between a computer's CPU and its operating system using an abstraction layer called a hypervisor. The hypervisor emulates all the functions of a real computer and its CPU in a virtual machine. It can run multiple virtual machines at the same time, and each virtual machine can run any compatible operating system, such as Windows or Linux. Azure takes this virtualization technology and repeats it on a massive scale in Microsoft data centers throughout the world. Each data center has many racks filled with servers. Each server includes a hypervisor to run multiple virtual machines. A network switch provides connectivity to the servers. One server in each rack runs a special piece of software called a fabric controller. Each fabric controller is connected to another special piece of software known as the orchestrator. The orchestrator is responsible for managing everything that happens in Azure, including responding to user requests. Users make requests using the orchestrator's web API. The web API can be called by many tools, including the user interface of the Azure portal. When a user makes a request to create a virtual machine, the orchestrator packages everything that's needed, picks the best server rack, then sends the package and request to the fabric controller. Once the fabric controller has created the virtual machine, the user can connect to it. Azure makes it easy for developers and IT professionals to be agile when they build, deploy, and manage their applications and services. But this agility can have unintended consequences if unauthorized resources are created, or if resources are left running after they're no longer needed. The solution to this problem is to use Azure's resource access management tools as part of your organization's governance program.
Right, so that's how things will work at the back end. So it's very important for us to understand how things work at the back end. So I just thought of getting a glimpse on that, okay, or bringing a glimpse on that to you guys. Okay, right, so we understood a little bit on how things work in the Azure environment. So let us quickly jump into another basic funda, or another basic concept that which we should be aware now, which is regions. Now, like any service provider, Azure has its presence across the globe. So when we say across the globe, they divided their entire infrastructure into geographies, regions, and that's how they categorize their presence. Now, if you look at this, what do you call it as map, you can see their presence across the globe. We'll quickly get into the portal and try to see what exactly and how exactly they are spanned across. Okay, so let me quickly take you Azure geographies or infrastructure, right? Infrastructure regions. Now, if I go to this Azure infrastructure regions, what does they say? They say that they have their presence in 58 regions, which means that 140 countries. Now, this map, whatever it shows their presence across the globe. You see their presence in Americas, you see their presence in Europe, and of course, Middle East, Asia, and Asia Pacific. Right now, how did they categorize their environment? At a high level, they call it as geographies. Right, so Azure divides their environment into geographies like Americas. Americas includes both North and South America, and of course including Canada as well. And they include regions of Europe into a geography called as Europe, so as Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and then Asia Pacific. So they have categorized their infrastructure into geographies. Now, each geography in turn will have something called as regions. right? So a geography is a higher level than a region, right? A geography is a higher level than region. Now, what is a region? A region is nothing but a group of data centers, maybe in a single location or maybe one or two additional locations. A region can have additional locations as well. So your geography comprises of one or more regions, and a region can have a set of data centers with a very good network connectivity. Now you can further divide your regions into something called as availability zones. Now let us try to understand that. So whatever you see here, the circles with blue color filled, they're all regions which are active. And if you see anything with dotted circles, which means that they announced those regions, but they are not in production yet. Okay, so we understood these two, but there are some diamond symbols here and there, right? So we see some diamonds within those circles. Now, what are these? They call it as availability zones. So what are these availability zones? Now, availability zones are part of your regions. So as I said earlier, a region will have data centers, right? This region 2 has got two data centers. But region 1, whatever you see here towards your, what do you call it as right side, it has got data centers, but they are categorized into something called as availability zones. Now, availability zone is, you can compare it with a location with data centers, and these data centers are independent of each other, which means if you say that availability zone 1 has got two data centers, availability zone 2 has got two data centers, and availability 3 has got two data centers, these data centers are independent of each other. In what way? They are independent of each other. Reason being, they don't share the common network. They are independent of each other. Reason being, they don't use the common power supply. And they are independent of each other because they don't use common cooling. So what is the advantage for you as a customer? So if I am going and deploying certain resources in region 1, if I put my workload spanning across different availability zones, if the data centers in one of the availability zones are not available, my workloads are still running on the other availability zones. So that is the advantage you as a customer going to get. So then a question is, how is that? I mean, I don't see all the regions having that availability zone solution. Only a bunch. You can count them on fingers, around 8 to 9, maybe on 10 different regions. So how is that I'm going to attain high availability if I don't have availability zones? There are other solutions that which we can use it, which we are not going to discuss, but there are solutions. So to understand their infrastructure, what we need to know is they have at a very high level something called as geographies, and then below that they have regions, and each region may or may not have availability zones. Now, if you have an availability zone, it's recommended to go and use it because it provides additional level of, what do you call it as, availability when it comes to your workloads on this cloud infrastructure. Right now, that is something which we should be knowing. Now, if you go to the geographies, you can look at their, Americas. Within that they have these regions, right? So these are the different regions within America. So as Europe, and then of course Asia Pacific, and then you see Middle East, Middle East Africa, right? These are all different geographies. And of course, if you look at Asia Pacific, you see the different regions within Asia Pacific, right? Central, South, and West India as well is listed here. Now, if you want to look at the locations where exactly these data centers are, then you can go to the location option here. Then you see, okay, so if in South India, okay, where is it? It is in Chennai. If it is West India, it is in Mumbai, and so on. So you can see where exactly their data centers are located as well. Okay? So this is something about their, what do you call it as, infrastructure across the different regions within the across the globe. Okay? This is about regions. And let us try to understand, how do I use these? How do I use cloud on Azure? For those who haven't, who don't know, who are new, There are multiple ways of accessing and managing the cloud infrastructure within Azure, right? Most of the cloud service providers provide a portal to manage it. And that is in alignment with a cloud feature called as on-demand self-service, we call it as, right? Now, what is on-demand self-service? You provision things on your own. You don't rely on somebody else. There is no wait time, right? So that is the advantage of you moving to the cloud. So your portal through which you can provision and manage and maintain the resources on your own, or you can also use a PowerShell command line interface. If you are good at that, go and get those modules of Azure, have those modules imported and use command lines on PowerShell to deploy and manage things. Or you can also go with something called as Azure CLI. There's a specific command line interface for Azure itself. Now, what is the difference between PowerShell and Azure CLI? That is also shell, and of course, this is also a command line shell. Now, Azure CLI, you can install it across the different operating system platforms. In the sense, if you are a Linux user, you can go and install Azure CLI on a Linux machine. And of course, if you are a Macintosh user, or if you use a Mac PC or whatever, then you can also go and use that. So it supports cross-platform, but the commands are also different, right? The commands for PowerShell are different from Azure CLI. Now you are a developer, you are good at Visual Studio .NET, you want to kind of go and code the resources that what you deploy. Of course, you rely on or use your Visual Studio .NET as well, so that you can attain that, what you call it as infrastructure as code, right? That is Visual Studio .NET. And of course, you can use JSON, widely used in Azure, that we call it as ARM templates. ARM templates will be created using a JSON, and of course use JSON and deploy the resources. And of course, you can also use some third-party tools. So when I say third-party tools, let us say you are good at Ruby or Python, then I can go and download the Azure Software Development Kits and start using whatever the programming language which I am comfortable with, because I got those SDKs whatever are needed to interact with my Azure cloud APIs, right? So one of these tools you can use it. So if it is a one-time deployment and you are not comfortable with programming, then you can go with Portal. But for a bulk deployments, you definitely have to go and rely on the other modes of deployment, not necessarily the Portal. Okay? So these are the different ways where you can manage and deploy things within the when you manage things on Azure cloud. Okay, so some terminologies which we need to understand before we get into the understanding further. Let us understand few basic terminologies or terms which are needed for us to understand the concepts that whatever we are going to discuss further. Now, one of the characteristics of cloud is pay as you go, right? We know that pay as you go, or pay for what you use. Now, how do you attain this future? Now, there should be a billing that which you should be doing based on certain categorization, right? So a development billing should be separate, a production billing should be separate, or maybe the department HR or department finance should have a separate billing. So how are we going to attain within the Azure cloud infrastructure? So this you can attain using a service called as subscriptions. Now, what is a subscription? A subscription will help you to categorize your resources within the tenant into multiple subscriptions based on either it might be organization structure or the resources that whatever you are going to use or whatever, right? Now, a subscription will help you to kind of go and categorize your billing. Let us say I have 5 different departments. I can go and create 5 different subscriptions and map my resources to that subscription so that it bills only in that subscription wherever the resources are being used by that department. Now in this diagram, in this map that what you are seeing here, you can see two subscriptions, right? You can see two different subscriptions. And these two subscriptions has got below them something called as resource groups. We'll understand what resource groups are. So a subscription, as I said, will be helpful for billing, which means that when I am creating multiple subscriptions here, I'll map it to certain department or certain environment. Now the resources under this subscription will be built together to this particular subscription, so that you are getting that, what do you call it, as understanding, or you will having that control to know how much resource is being used by what department, and you can bill it to that specific department. So that is the one of the usage of your subscriptions. And the other usage of subscriptions is you can go and set up some policies. You can go and define your role-based access control, which says like, okay, an L4 administrator should get access to the entire structure that whatever you have, or an L1 administrator should get access to only certain resources under this particular subscription. That level of administration can also be done using subscriptions. So what we need to understand, at least for what we are discussing today, is subscription means billing. Subscription will help you to categorize billing based on your department or environment or any way of that which you want to categorize. And it will also help you to go and put those policies to restrict certain deployments. For example, you don't want your admins to deploying the infrastructure in certain regions, maybe US, or you don't want your admins to use or deploy certain sizes of VMs, in the sense which are let us say talk about high compute resources which cost a lot. Now accidentally somebody may deploy it, and you see some surprises when you see the billing. Now to avoid those kind of things, you can go and set up policies, and of course to manage the administration for a better administration purpose, you can use subscriptions for what do you call it as role-based access control. Right. So let us go and look at the other concept, other small terminology called as resource. Now, what is a resource? Now, any manageable entity that which you deploy within Azure, any manageable entity that which you deploy within Azure, you call it as a resource. Now, the resource might be a virtual machine, or resource might be a storage account, or resource might be a network interface card as well. So any entity that which you deploy within the Azure that can be manageable, we call it as resource. So when I deploy a resource, now I definitely have to map it to a subscription for billing, right? Now, any resource deployment does need a subscription. And of course, you need to give a name to it. That's the reason it should have a name. And of course, you have to tell the region where exactly your resource will go and sit. Now, you may want to deploy in central US or central India or South India, whatsoever, right? So you can go and deploy a resource in a specific region. That's the reason you have to go and specify the region as well. So when I deploy a resource, what are the things I need? Of course, I need a region. We had seen a few minutes back what are the different regions we have within the Azure. And we need subscription. We understood that is for billing. And of course, you need something called as resource group. Now, what is a resource group? Name itself will say, right? So a resource group is kind of group of resources. So why do you need a resource group? Right? So let us try to understand those things. A resource group, you can use that to categorize your resources further below your subscription level. You can call it as a folder kind of stuff. You can compare it with a folder. Now, what do you have in a folder? What do you keep in a folder? files or folders of certain category, right? So similarly, in Azure resource groups, you can put resources belong to certain category or resources belonging to the same category under one resource group. You can put it, and we call it as container. We can call it as container. And of course, the resources within a resource group can share same life cycle. That's what Microsoft says. Now, what does it mean, same life cycle? You can deploy the resources within the resource group at the same time. In the sense, multiple resources across the resource group can be deployed or managed collectively by using some tools or softwares, or even, like as I said, ARM templates or PowerShell or whatsoever. So you can manage them as a group. That's the reason they share the same life cycle. And of course, a resource group can have resources spanning across different geographical locations. When we say spanning across geographical locations, my production resource group, let us say I created a resource group called as production. My production resource group can have resources spanning across different regions. Maybe I can have 10 virtual machines in central India. I can have few virtual machines in West US, but they can be part of the same resource group because they belong to the same category of resources. So that's the reason your resource group can have resources not necessarily in the same region where you create the resource group, but they can also have, or they can be spanning across, or they can span across different geographical locations. Now there is the why then the question arises, most of the people will ask, if I put my resources belonging to the different geographical regions in a resource group, then why does my resource group need a region itself when I create it? It needs a region, reason being it has to save the schema, in the sense configuration information of your resources itself. That's the place where it goes and saves that configuration information. So to understand this further, if my resource group is not available for XYZ reasons, it will not impact the resources sitting in that resource group, but it will impact to only the way you manage things, right? If you want to manage the entire resources as a resource group, that's when you see some problem. Otherwise, you don't. So I don't want to confuse you too much on that. So what you want to understand, or what you need to understand here, is a resource group will have a group of resources which belongs to certain category, and that category will be same for all the resources. And then they can span across different regions, not necessarily in the region they should sit where your resource group is sitting. And of course, they may share the same life cycle. Okay? So these are the few important things that we should know when we talk about the resource groups. Now, let us say that I have two resource groups, resource group A and resource group B. I will be able to move the resources across the resource groups. There shouldn't be any problem as such in moving the resources across the resource groups. But there are few things that which you will be losing when you move the resources across the resource groups. Now, what is that? We'll try to understand maybe in our subsequent slides. Okay. Now, so this diagram, what you see here is an example of a production resource group which has got couple of resources, or 4 resources rather, a VM, and then of course a load balancer, a network interface card, and what do you call it as a web service, right? So these are the different resources that which you have within your production resource group. So let us go back and let us go further and try to understand things further. Now let us get into a quick lab to understand how do we create a resource group. Most of you might know, few of you might not know it, because there are few guys who are new to Azure also joined here. So I just want to kind of quickly show you how do we create a resource group and how do you move resources across the different resource groups. Let us quickly get into a small lab of 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm getting into my Azure portal. Right, so where do I find resource group? This is a portal. I can go and quickly search here something called as resource group service. I can search from here, or right, you can see it, right? You can resource, or I can find that in my favorites also. Anyway, it will take you to the same what do you call it as window where you provision or you kind of deploy the resource groups. And you see there are certain resource groups already. So let us try to create one quickly so that we understand what is that we need when you create a resource group. Now, this is what it will ask you when you create a resource group. It will ask you a subscription. If you have multiple subscriptions, you can go and select. I have two subscriptions here. One is personal, and of course, second one is pay as you go. I can go and select where I want to go and bill this in case if there is some billing where it should go and bill the cost, right? These are all subscriptions. That's what I was saying when we were discussing it. Now, resource group will carry a name for identification purpose. I'll name it as resource group. Okay, I'll name it as new. Okay, so new. And this resource group, as I said a few minutes back, it does need a region. It does need a region. You can go and put this in any one of the region. And apart from this will have something called as tags. Now, what is a tag? Tag will help you further logically organize the resources. So you can put a name value. For example, this resource group is, let us say, belongs to production environment. I'll put a name called as production. But there might be multiple departments which might be using production, what do you call it, as environment. Now, let us say this resource group is specifically for web servers. Then I can go within the production. It is a web server categorized. Okay, so it is web server, but what department? There might be multiple departments that might be using your web services. Then I'll go and put one more name value entry. I'll put this as some HR. So what does it mean? So I can categorize my resource group or any resource. This particular field, what you see, the tags is available across all the resources. So you are basically going and putting that name value. You are categorizing your resources. Okay, this belongs to this category. Now, what is the use of that? Tomorrow, when you want to generate certain reports, like let us say I need those web servers belonging to the HR department which are in production environment, then I can go and run a small query. I can get that list of resources. So that is the advantage of these tags, right? Okay, so this is tagging, and then of course review and create. So whenever you create a resource in Azure, it does a validation, whether it is syntactically correct, whether you gave right what do you call it as, whether you selected right what do you call it as values, or are there any issues. Then if so, then it will show you whether validation is passed or failed, right? So I'm quickly going ahead and creating this particular resource group, and of course you can see here in the notification what do you call it as bell, whether the resource is deployed or not. And this is how you can go and deploy a resource group, and you should be able to see that resource group in a while here. Or you can go to that directly from here as well, right? Now this resource group is an empty resource group because we didn't use this anywhere, right? So we didn't use this and we didn't deploy any resources using this resource group. That's the reason you see things here empty, right? Empty here. So that's how you can create a resource group. Okay? Now let us quickly understand how do we kind of move resources from one resource group to the other resource group. Let us say that we'll try to understand deploying the resource. Anyway, we'll deploy a few virtual machines as we move on. Let us say you have a resource group here, and this resource group name is RG1. And this resource group is in a location called as Central US. If you see it, it is in Central US, right? You can see this here in Central US. But this resource group is holding resources belongs to what do you call it as West India as well. That's why I was saying, right? What are the resources here within this resource group? Different geographical locations. Okay, so right. So that's one thing that which we need to understand. Now I want to move these resources, whatever I have. Let us say that I named this resource group uh, okay. I think I don't have any solution at this point of time. I don't know what exactly the problem is, but let us continue. Let us continue. So let us say that you named this resource group incorrectly. Let us say that you named this resource group incorrectly. So during the resource group creation, instead of creating a resource group with the name called as RG, just RG, you created RG1. Will I be able to rename this resource group? No, there is no option as such. So what I need to do, I need to go, or I may continue with the same name that whatever I have, or I may have to move these resources to a new resource group with the name that whatever I want to have. So those are certain situations where you may get into into kind of performing the task of moving the resources across the resource groups. Now it is very simple, straightforward, right? So you select the resources, whatever you have. You have here an option called as move resources to another group. So it is straightforward. Okay, select this and move that, right? And then what does it ask? It will ask you, boss, select the resources that which you want to move. Do you want to move everything? Then of course select all, otherwise select only those resources that which you want to move. Okay, so we selected the resources. What is the destination resource group? I want to move these resources to a resource group called as RG2. Now, does this movement have any impact? Yes, it does. It is not just right click and move, or select, click on move and click on that move option and then select move resources, but it does have impact. Now, what is the impact? Now you are acknowledging something here. If you read it, it is Azure is asking, boss, you understand that moving these resources will not move the scripts or policies or the tools, anything that which you associated in your source resource group. In the sense, if there are certain scripts at your resource group level which are tagged to these resources, they may not be moved or they may not work. Or let us say there are certain policies that which you defined at the resource group level, which is your source resource group RG1, they will not be moved to your destination resource group RG2. This is the impact. So either you have to go and reconfigure them, or you need to revert back if you don't want to do it. Only two solutions, right? So I'm fine. I can quickly go and move those resources, right? You can go like this. You can move the resources across the different resource groups, and of course you can move resources to different subscriptions as well, right? You let us say that you have two different subscriptions, and for some reason, let us say you deployed a resource incorrectly in pay as you go, whatever the subscription you had seen, which you want to move to your another subscription called as what do you call it as uh, personal. So you can do it. So you can go and move your resources even across the subscriptions as well. So that is very much possible. Okay, so your Azure will validate, and then of course it will move the resources. It will take a couple of minutes, but we'll switch back to our content, right? So this is a small lab on kind of understanding the resource groups and then moving the resources across the resource groups, right? Now let us quickly jump into, let us get into little bit, what do you call it as further in understanding. Um, so let us start with networking. Okay, so I want to start with networking and then switch to the compute part. Now, before we get into networking, guys, if you're not speaking, I request you to go on mute. It will disturb everybody. Thank you. Right. So before we get into this networking of Azure, then we'll try to let us try to understand a little bit some those things, that the terms or terminologies or concepts that which we need to understand networking concepts. Okay. So one among them is CIDR, right? Now, CIDR stands for Classless Interdomain Routing. I'm not going to discuss in depth, but whatever is needed for us to understand certain things, that's what we are going to discuss here. Now, what is this CIDR format? Now, it is used to represent your IP address range. It is used to represent your IP address range. Now, if my network, whatever I am going to have in my Azure environment, what are those series of IP addresses that what I should be using? If I am going to use, let us say 10.x IP addresses, from what range to what range my resources should get those IP addresses? It is not only from what range to what range, but how many IP addresses. So Azure uses this format of what you call it as classless inter-domain routing to represent your network IP addressing. Now, how is that it is represented? You represent it using a notation or representation called something like this. So this is your IP address, and N defines how many IP addresses you get. And it also defines within your IP address range, what is your network subnet or host subnet. So this is a normal representation. If you don't have an understanding on this, I request you to go and spend some time here. Most of the times, if you are kind of administration, not into network administration, if there is a network team separately in your organization, then you get these things from your network team. But it's good to know these things. Okay, so if you want to know how many IP addresses that which you get, if you represent your kind of network like this, a.b.c.d/n. So the number of IP addresses that what I get is nothing but 2 power 32 minus n. So based on the value of n you define here, the number of IP addresses you get will vary. So if you define this as a 24, then under this particular range, I'm going to get 256 IP addresses. How 256? 2 power 32 minus 24, 2 power 8, which is nothing but 256 IP addresses. So from what range to what range? It says /24, which means that remove the first 24 octets, and this is the number that which is going to change. So which means you get the IP addresses from 1 to 225. In the sense, you get 192.168.0.1, 0.2, 3, 4, 5 till 225. Okay, so this is what we should be knowing when you go and kind of create your networking components within Azure. So let us quickly jump into the further concept topic that what we need to understand within Azure, which is Azure networking. Now, Azure networking has got multiple, what do you call it as, components, multiple services. I don't call it as component services. So networking is a generalized term, right? Azure networking is a generalized term. And networking may have your virtual network, it may have your firewalls, it may have what do you call it as security groups, it may have what do you call it as application security group, load balancers and content delivery networks, traffic managers, whatnot, right? So it's a vast subject. The networking itself is a vast subject. But within the network, what we are going to understand is virtual networking, which is the basic thing that what we should know when we start learning about Azure. Now, what is virtual network? Before we discuss the virtual network on Azure, let us try to discuss network on our in our data center, what do you call it as environment. So let us say that you have you have a location with a data center, and how do you categorize or segment your network within your on-premises? Use a concept, or you use something called as VLANs, virtual LANs, right? Where you divide your network based on okay, DMZ, this VLAN, production, this VLAN, development, this, training, this, and so on, right? The same thing you are attaining on Azure using a concept called as virtual network. So virtual network is a segmentation of your private network within your Azure environment. So you're dividing your Azure environment into multiple sub-components called as virtual networks. Now, what is that it will help you with? What is that your VLANs on on-premises environment will help you with? Segmentation, division, isolation, right? Restricting the communication. The same thing your virtual network on Azure will help you with. It will help you with segmentation of your network. It will help you with isolation of your networks. So what is virtual network? It is a network component within Azure, which will help you to segment and isolate your private network within the Azure. Why do I need that? I need it. Maybe I want to divide my environment, want to restrict the communication between DMZ and prod, or maybe dev and prod, kind of, right? So you definitely want to have that type of environment, that structure. That's what is going to help you. And what are those components that which it will connect? What are those components that which it will connect or interact with? So let me quickly open a MS Paint application so that I can show you a little bit in depth. Right, so let us say that this is your Azure environment. Okay, so think this is your Azure environment. So what is that you are doing here? You are dividing your network into multiple components called as virtual networks. And each virtual network, of course, will have a name for identification purpose. And it will have a location which tells, okay, so this virtual network should go and sit in central US or whatsoever. And as I said in our earlier discussion, it needs an IP address space. Now, why IP address space? I am telling my Azure that whoever sits in this particular virtual network should be using an IP address of this range. So that is the use of what you call it as VNet. So when I create a VNet, I am providing the location, I am providing the address space, whatever my VNet should be using. And I can go and create the n number of, there is upper limit where you can go and look that in the limits and quotas within the Azure documentation to understand how many virtual network I can create within a subscription. There is a limit there. Okay, so there is a limit. And similarly, let us say you have one more VNet, and of course you can have VNets like this. I'll name this, let us say, training. I may name this as dev. I may name this as prod. Right, guys? Let us say my prod, what is this? Okay, somebody is playing with my screen. Okay, can you stop doing that? Okay, thank you. Don't interrupt, guys. Okay, so let us say that this VNet is using an IP address something like this /16, which means around 65,000 IP addresses I can get. If I go and use that math 2 power 32 minus 16, which is 2 power 16, where it will be 65,536 or 56 maybe. Okay, so as this will have its own address space, some x dot x dot x dot x slash n. Now, by default, the behavior within the Azure environment, two VNets will not communicate with each other. That's how you are attaining that isolation part. So two VNet within the Azure environment will not communicate with each other. That is the default behavior. And of course, you can go and enable communication by using something called as VNet peering or virtual network gateway VPN. Also, you can use if you want to use a VPN solution between the VNets as well. You can enable that communication, but the default behavior that what we need to understand between the VNets, the communication is blocked. So you're attaining those two features called as segmenting division of your network, and of course the isolation, reason being there is no communication between them. Okay, now, so what are those components with which it can interact? A VNet can interact with another VNet provided you have peering. It can interact your on-premises environment. If this is your on-premises, let us say you have a hybrid infrastructure where you have cloud as well as on-premises, then you use some VPN solution, and through this VPN solution, your, what do you call it, as gateway will, your VNet will talk to your on-premises. So it is not only to interact within the VNets if you want to, with across the VNets if you want to, the VNets will also help you to kind of establish connectivity to your on-premises. And of course, they can go to the internet as well if you allow it. The outgoing, if you allow it to the internet. By default, it is allowed. Right? So this is what your VNet is. So we understood what a VNet is. We understood what do you say it as, where do we use it? And of course, we understood what are the different components, right, to which it will connect. Now, when I create a VNet, what are those things that which are needed? When I created a resource group, what were those things that which I feeded there? Of course, a subscription for billing. And a resource group is needed when I create a VNet because it is a resource. Any resource you create does need a resource group and of course a subscription and of course a location. These are all common things, whatever the resource you create. So like any other resource, VNet also need a subscription, VNet also need a resource group, VNet also need a location. And then you need a address space. Now this address space will tell what are those, what is that range of IP addresses my machines which are part of the VNets will be able to use. We'll see that practically. Okay, so just if you have any questions, hold them. Okay, if you have any questions, hold them. Okay, so we understood this. The next concept that what we need to understand is subnets. Now your VNets can further be divided into something called as subnets. You can further categorize your VNets into something called as subnets. My subnets will sit in the same location where my VNet is because they are part of the VNet. That is point one. My subnet will use the subset or the entire IP address space that whatever I define at the VNet level because they are part of VNet. So if I have two subnets here, let us say this is subnet 1 and this is subnet 2. These two subnets will use the IP address range that whatever I defined here. They will be part of this IP address range or they have to use the same range. If I have, let us say, only one subnet, let us say I have only one subnet, I can use the entire address space. If I have multiple subnets, they share this address space. One address space may use up to certain address IP addresses, the other can use from there to some extent and so on, right? So you can divide that. Now, what is the advantage that which I get when I divide my VNet into further? Let us say, as I named earlier, let us name this as a production virtual network. Let us name this as a production virtual network. A production virtual network can have a production servers which may belong to different categories. In the sense, a production VNet can have servers related to web, which means that web production servers. A production VNet can also have servers related to the database. That means that you can categorize your production environment further. Or maybe some application servers in a separate subnet. So by using this concept of subnets, I can further segment, not isolation. I'm only using the segment word. Remember this. You can further segment your virtual network. The reason why I didn't use the isolation, reason being, by default, the resources across the subnets will be able to communicate with each other. They will be able to communicate with each other. So the resources in the VNet are nothing but, so when you create a resource that needs an IP address, where you go and put it? You put it in a subnet. You put in this one here. You cannot put it here within the VNet. So when I deploy a resource that needs a networking, that needs IP address, I need to put them in subnets. So that's the reason you need to go and create a VNet. And if there is a requirement, you can create multiple subnets, or you will be creating at least one subnet within a VNet during the VNet creation. Hope that makes it clear. So a VNet, a subnet, and we understood what the subnet will have. It will have the resources that needs IP addresses, and subnet will share this IP address range, that whatever you defined here, we'll see that in a while practically, whatever you defined here. Okay, so let me switch back to my thing. Okay, so we understood what is subnet, where do we need it, further segmentation of your VNet, and why do we need it, and where do we use it to categorize further, as I said, and what components within network it connects. It connects to your components within the VNet. Of course, it can interact with other components across the VNet, provided you have this communication enabled. Or it can talk to the internet through the VNet itself, right? So that is anyway we understood. So if the VNet is, if there is a communication between the VNets enabled, then it can talk across the VNets as well, right? So that is subnets. Okay, so let me go ahead and quickly jump to what is that? Okay, what is that you need to create a subnet? Okay, so okay, we'll come to this. So let us quickly go and practically see how do we create a virtual network within the Azure environment. Okay, so you see this diagram here, right? So you have a VNet with the name called as prod VNet, and within that prod VNet you see two subnet. One is web subnet and second one is database subnet, right? So this is what we are going to go and create it now. Okay, so let me jump to the Azure portal. I'm here in the virtual networks, right? So this is a service that which we will be using. Now, what does this English say here? Create a virtual network to securely connect your Azure resources, right, to each other. And of course, connect to your virtual network to your on-premises environment by using a VPN solution. Of course, if you have something called as ER, we call it as express route, you can also use that, right? Okay, so let me go and create a virtual network first and try to understand this. So this is where you start the creation of your virtual network. So I just want to concentrate on this English again, okay? So it is a fundamental building block of your private network. It enables you many types of resources such as VMs to securely communicate with each other. So internal communication purpose, you definitely need a VNet. And not only that, to the internet also. And not only that, to the on-premises environment. Right? So that's what your VNet does. And that's what we discussed. Okay, so during the creation of VNet, I need to select my subscription. Now the question arises, how is that my virtual networks be built? If I create 10 virtual network, will it be built based on the count of the VNets I have? No, not that. A VNet creation will not have any billing. The traffic that moves in and out of the VNets, based on that, your billing will be. Okay, so that is another thing that which you should know. So the billing is not because you created a virtual network. The billing will be based on what is that, how much networks you used, how much speed, how much GB of what do you call it as data transfer or across the VNets, subnets is happened. Based on that, you will be charged. And if you want to know more on that, so there is something called as Azure Calculator. Go and spend some time there. Or you can also refer to their documentation that will also explain you how the VNet is built. Okay? Now, so that is your subscription. And you need to go and put this in a resource group. So let me say that I want to go and put this in a resource group called as RG new, which we just created few minutes back. And this particular virtual network, what you are creating, has got a boundary of region. You need to understand this as well. So when I say boundary of the region, your network, virtual network is not visible other than the regions where you created it. So let us say you are creating this particular virtual network in a location called as Central US, which is my favorite location. This resource, this virtual network will be visible only in that region. If I'm going and deploying a virtual machine in Central India, and I want to put that virtual machine in this VNet called as VNet 1, that whatever we are going to create, or prod VNet, whatever we are going to create, you will not be able to see this virtual network there because it is in a different region altogether. Okay, so another important point. Okay, so I'll go and name this as prod. I think we are 8 minutes ahead. Okay, so this I'm name it as prod. So this is the first, we call this as blades. Okay, this is called as blade. This is our first blade. And I'm going to go and get into the second blade where you define the IP addresses. Now, this is the place where you say, okay, my VNet has to use this IP address range. Now, by default, it picks some IP address range in 10.0.0.0/16. I'm going to leave that as is. I'm not going to change that. So any resource that which will get deployed will be getting an IP address from whatever you defined here. Now, how many IP addresses you are getting? 65,536 IP addresses, which means that 10.0.0.0/16 will give you an IP address range from 10.0.0.0 to 10.0.255.255. Those many IP addresses. Maybe you need to spend some time here, but yeah, because of the interest of the time, I'm quickly forwarding it, moving ahead. And I have to create at least one subnet when I create a VNet. That's what I was saying. I cannot directly put a resource within the VNet. No, you cannot put a VM within the VNet. You have to put a VM in a subnet. Or I cannot put a load balancer here in the VNet. I have to put that in a subnet, which will be in turn part of your VNet. Okay, so that's the reason during the creation of the virtual network, what it does, it asks you to create at least one subnet. Okay, so I'll name this subnet as web subnet. Okay, and I'm leaving that with the default IP address that whatever it is picking, which gives you somewhere around 256 IP addresses. When I put /24, 2 power 32 minus 24 is 2 power 8, which is 256 IP addresses. Now what you see here is, okay, I'm getting 256 IP addresses, but 251 plus 5 Azure reserved IP addresses. So what does it mean? It means you are losing 5 IP addresses every time you create a subnet. So when you do a calculation of your IP addresses, you need to keep in mind that you will be losing 5 IP addresses, and those IP addresses will be used by Azure for internal purposes. We'll see that what is that internal purpose and why it needs, but you will be losing 5 IP addresses. Okay, so let me go ahead and create this. But my requirement is I have to create one more subnet called as database subnet. I can go and create straight away from here with the name called as database subnet. And of course, I can give the IP address range, whatever is available. I'll give it as 1.0/24, right? I'll give 1.0/24. Now, this particular subnet is getting 256 IP addresses again, but out of them, 5 are reserved by your Azure. Okay, so again, I get only 251 IP addresses. Likewise, you can go and create subnets as per your requirement by following the principle that I have to use subset of the IP addresses range, that whatever I defined here. Okay. Now, so I'm not going to go and discuss the other things. Okay, at a very high level, DDoS. DDoS stands for denial of service, right? Which is a threat most of the organizations will face, right? So where people will do a lot of ping requests to a specific server, and at one point the server will reach to a stage where it cannot handle the load and it crashes, right? So those type of issues, if you want to kind of override, there are two solutions here. Basic is by default enabled. That means that you get certain level of security when it comes to the denial of service. If you want to go little advanced, you can go to the standard. And of course, there is a firewall. If you want to tag a firewall to a VNet, you can do it. Which means that any traffic which is entering or moving out of the VNet will be going through your firewall, right? So which we are not going to discuss in detail now. And tags we had already discussed, and of course, review and create. So now what it does, it creates a production VNet, which will have two subnets, web subnet and database subnet. And it sits in which region? Central US, right? Go ahead and create it. And this is how you can create a virtual network in Azure. Okay? Now, so let me go back to my content. So let us try to understand these reserved IP addresses, okay? So let me quickly take you to their documentation. Azure Subnet. Okay, these questions are all available in FAQs. Okay, so I suggest you to look at FAQs where you get answers to most of these questions. Okay, so I need to go to the virtual network FAQs. So most of the answers to the questions, where are these going, kind of. So you'll get those answers in your FAQs. Okay. Now, are there any restrictions of using IP addresses within this? Okay, so there are 5 reserved IP addresses. You can see it. So what are they? From 0 to 3, 0 to 3, which means that x.x.x.0, x.x.x.1, 2, 3. They're all reserved. And of course, your last IP address 255, which is the broadcast IP address. Now, these are all the IP addresses that which are reserved for Azure internal purpose at each subnet level. Okay. Now 0.0, it is a network address they use for, and 1 anyway we know that it is used for gateway, and 2 and 3 they use to map their internal Azure DNS, and of course 255 for what you call it as broadcast. So the DNS servers, that whatever you define here at the VNet level, we'll see that we can define a VNet a DNS IP address at VNet level. So to map them, they use these two IP addresses. Okay, so those are the IP addresses that which are not available for you. In the sense, if you are using 10.0.0.0 to 10.0.0.255, the first 4 IP addresses 10.0.0.0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, these are all not available. So your machine will start getting IP address from 4, or your resources will start getting IP addresses from 4. And of course 255, anyway we understand it's a broadcast, which we don't use it. Now at VNet level, another interesting thing that what we should know here. At VNet level, I cannot use these IP addresses. Now what are they? A multicast IP address, understandable. A broadcast IP address of 255.255.255.255, you cannot use it. That is also understandable. Loopback address, you cannot use it. But these are other 2 IP addresses ranges that which you cannot use it. Reason, the last one is used by Azure for internal DNS purpose, and the other one they use for something called as link local. I don't know what it is, but they are using that. Right? So these are all the IP addresses. You cannot use these at VNet level, and these are the IP addresses which are not available at your subnet level. Okay? Now, let me go back. Right? So we understood these things. So the next concept that what we need to understand is NSGs. Okay? NSG stands for Network Security Group. Now, what is it? It's a firewall. You can compare it with a software firewall because it is not a physical device, right? So that's why it is called software file. I call it as software file. Now, any firewall, whatever the activities that it does, the same thing your NSG will do. Now, what are those activities any firewall for that matter will do it? It restricts traffic, or it will allow the traffic. Only 2 activities, right? Either drop or either allow. So your NSG will do the same thing. Whether you want to allow certain traffic, then define those rules, define those conditions. Wherever you want to allow the traffic, if the condition is met, door is opened, your traffic will enter. If the condition doesn't meet, the packet is dropped and the traffic will not be moving. That's how any normal firewall does. Same thing here, right? Now, as I listed here, allows traffic inside or denies, right? That is nothing but allow and deny. Okay, so if I need to use these NSGs at Azure level, by just creating an NSG will not help. I need to go and associate this NSG to certain entity, and whenever traffic entering into that particular entity, based on the condition that whatever you define, it will be allowed or denied. Now, what are those things to which I can associate an NSG? You can associate an NSG to a subnet. In the sense, if I go back to my diagram, I can associate an NSG to a subnet. I can associate to these things. So you can filter your traffic at subnet level. Though your traffic is entering your VNet, you can put a condition at your subnet level to drop or to allow the traffic. Right? So that is the advantage of your NSG. It's not only at the subnet level. You can associate your NSG to a VM as well. So when I say a VM, to be more precise and specific, you will be associating it to the network interface card of the VM. So which means whenever any traffic enters to a subnet, it gets validated itself at subnet level. If you define NSG here with some rules, even if it enters here, you can put one more rule which can allow or drop the traffic. So that's what we are trying to understand here. You can associate your, what you call it as NSGs, to your subnets or to your virtual machines. Okay? Now each NSG will have rules. So if I create an NSG, what does it will have? It will have rules. Each NSG will have a rule, one or more rules. Based on the rules that whatever you define here in the NSG, the traffic will be allowed or denied. So what are those rules? How can I create a rule? To create a rule, you need to know what is your source. You need to know what is your destination. If a traffic is coming from so and so source, reaching to so and so destination, I want to write a rule saying that allow the traffic. That's what you can go and define, right? So if a traffic is coming from internet and trying to reach to a subnet called as web subnet, that is my source and destination. But you can further divide that into more granular, right? What port? If a traffic is coming from internet to the web server subnet on a port called 8443, what is the action? Allow. Same thing you define here, right? So whenever you create an NSG, after the creation of the NSG, you go and define the rules, and these rules will help your NSG to make those decisions whether it should allow or deny a traffic. Let us quickly get into our what do you call it as Azure portal and see how do we create an NSG. NSG, you can go to something called as network security groups, and then you can create NSG here. Now, what does English here says? Create network security group with rules to filter the inbound and outbound traffic. Okay, and from where? From your virtual networks or from your subnets, right? That is the advantage of your network security groups. So let me go and create one network security group quickly. Right. So like any resource, you need a subscription, you need a resource group, a name to identify your NSG. I'll name it as web NSG because I want to create some rules for my subnet called as web. And I need to put in the same location where my subnets and VNets are residing, where my subnet is residing. It resides in central US, the web subnet that whatever I just created. The other things are not needed, right? Review and create all these things are not needed. I'll go and straight away create a network security group. Right, you can see it is deployment in progress. Once you have that, you quickly go and configure those rules. So within your NSG, what you can do, you can go and create the rules based on your requirement. What rules you can create? You can create two types of rules. One is inbound rule, second one is outbound rule. As the name says, inbound rule or inbound rules are applicable to the traffic that which is coming into the Azure network. Outbound rules are applied to the traffic that which is going out of your Azure environment. To be specific, when I say Azure environment, as I said earlier, you can associate your network security group to what? To network interface cards, to subnets. So if this is associated to a subnet, these rules are applicable to the traffic that which is going out of the subnet, coming into the subnet. That's what we need to know. Okay. So this is your default NSG. Do you see any rules here? Zero inbound and outbound rules because we didn't configure anything. Did we associate this to any of the VM or network interface card or subnets? No, that's the reason you see 00 here. Correct? Now, what we need to know is we need to quickly get into the settings. Within settings, you have something called as inbound security rules. Now, what are these inbound security rules? There are three default inbound security rules that which are there by default when you create a NSG. Similarly, there are three default outbound rules that which will be there when you create an NSG. And to understand this further, you will not be able to delete these default security rules. I think I said groups, it is rules. You will not be able to delete these default rules because it is grayed out, right? So what all I can do is I can just go and what do you call it as disable these or enable this, but I cannot delete these things. Similarly, with the inbound, you will have three inbound rules. You will not be able to delete them. You can only disable from here, right? Now, if I want to add my own custom security inbound rules, I need to go here and add it. So what am I doing now? I'm adding an inbound rule. Now, as I said earlier, when I want to add an inbound rule, what does it need? It needs a source, it needs a destination. Now, what is a source? Source can be any one of these. It says any. The first option, what you see is any, right? In the sense, any traffic which is coming from anywhere, that is the source. Or if you want to hard code to an IP address or an IP address range, you can select IP address and define the range of IP addresses in a CIDR format. Or if it is an individual IP, define the individual IP here. Or if it is a group of IP addresses, put the commas or some separation values and define all those things. So you're defining your IP address range as a source as well. You can go and do it if that is your requirement. So one is any, second one is IP address. More specific here, you are specifying here the IP addresses. The third one is service tag. The service tag will help you to kind of select the source based on the services. Now, what are those services? There is a huge list here. There's a huge list. Now, to understand this, let us say that I want to kind of have this rule to a traffic which is coming from a SQL service. Then I can go and select here a SQL management. Or let us say my source should be traffic which is coming from a service called as backup. Then that can be my source. Or let us say I want to have this traffic which is coming from any of the traffic from internet. I can go and select service tag as internet. So based on your requirement, so what you can do is you can go and select the service tag. Right, so it will help you to kind of go and have these rules based on services. And not just service, but region specific services, right? If you see it, service bus South Central India, service bus North UK North, kind of, right? You can further categorize them. There is service tag. And there is something called as application security group. This is similar to your NSG itself, but at application level, you can create application, what do you call it as security group. It is more specific to the apps. That also you can use it. So you can use one of these as a source. Let us say I want to go with source as internet. But what is the source port? Okay, if a traffic is originating from internet, what is the source port if you want to monitor more in specific at the port wise? So if a traffic is coming, let us say source as 80, source port as 80, then what is the source rule? Traffic coming from internet, which is coming over the port number called 80, reaching a destination, select the destination here. Again, you see certain values, parameters here, any, which means that within the Azure, anything, it is trying to communicate anywhere, or within the Azure, only the specific range of IP addresses, or within the Azure to a VNet or application security group. So the destination, you don't have service tags. Okay? In destination, you don't have service tags. In place of service tags, what you have is virtual networks. Right, you can go and select your destination. So you selected source, you selected source port, you selected destination, and if you select an IP address range, you can go and hard code the IP address. And once you have the source destination, you can go and select the destination port as well. So let us say I'm trying to access a web server from the internet, which is sitting in subnet called as web subnet. Then I can go and define rules accordingly. Okay, so to quickly complete it, what I do is I'll go and create a rule for, yeah, for this web subnet, which is 10.0.0.0/24 to allow traffic on port 80. Okay, so that's my requirement, right? So let me go and quickly create a rule. So what is the rule? Anything that which is coming on the internet, I'm not going to put a source port. I put it as star, any port. But when it's trying to reach my subnet, which is web subnet, and that subnet has got an IP address range of what? 10.0.0/24, right? So that is the IP address range we have here. So that is my destination. So what I'm saying, anything, any traffic that which is coming from the internet, trying to reach the destination 10.0.0.24 on a specific port called 80, or maybe if you're using some secure, what do you call, web services, 443, right? What protocol? Whether it is TCP, whether it is UDP, or if it is a ping kind of stuff, ICMP. Or if you're not aware, you can go with any. So because your web traffic, HTTP and HTTPS flow on TCP, I can go and select the protocol. Okay, so I said source, destination, port number, protocol, but what is the action this particular rule should do? When this condition met, what should be the action that should be taken? Allow or deny, right? So my requirement is to allow the traffic, right? My requirement is to allow the traffic. That's the reason I select allow. Now, another important thing what you have is priority. Let us say you have similar rules, possibility, say meeting the same condition. So then your priority will come into picture. Now, how does this priority work? You can define a priority number, and the priority number, the higher the priority number, the lower the priority. Which means if you are having two rules, one let us say with 100, the other let us say with 200, which one is going to win? 100 is going to win. So the lower the number, the higher the priority. The higher the number, the lower the priority. Now the priority, when I define, I can define between only 100 and 4096. So that is the range I can use. I cannot use any priority number below 100, any priority number above 4096. So when you create a rule, you need to make sure that you have a priority. Let us say this is a priority 100. And I have a name here for identification. I'll identify this as allo HTTP, or I'll put it as general web from internet, right? Identification purpose. And then go and put the description. Another very important thing that which you should be aware as an administrator, or even when you design things, your priority numbers, if I'm recreating this first rule, right? If I create one more rule, I cannot go and select 101, never do that. So go and give some space between the priority numbers that what you choose. Now, why do you need this? Who knows, tomorrow you may have to put a rule between two priorities, right? Now, that's what, uh, when I read some documentation, what they say is, must go and give some space between the priority numbers that which you use within your NSG when you create rules. Now, the other thing, as I said, you can use only priorities between 100 and 4096. The lower the number, the higher the priority. The higher the number, the lower the priority. Okay? Things to know. I am creating my first NSG rule. Now that NSG rule is with priority 100. What is that it is doing? Any traffic which is coming from this service tag called is internet, which is reaching the subnet IP address of a subnet called as web subnet on port 80 and 443 should be allowed. That's what it is doing. Right? You have a rule. Now, if you observe this, the rule that which you created just now, the rule that which you created just now is having higher priority than the default rules. Right? Now, even if I go with 4096, the range for to which I mean the last number, right? 4096. Even that will also override the default routes that rules that whatever you have, not routes, rules, whatever you have. So when you write, excuse me, go on mute, guys. When you write your when you write your rules, those rules will override the default rules that whatever you have at your NSG level. Okay. Now, similarly, if you want to kind of restrict traffic which is moving out of the subnet or web subnet in our case, I'll go and write a rule for outgoing. So in Azure, this is how it is. By default, anything that which enters is restricted. Anything that goes out is allowed. So how is that it is? By default, everything, whatever is coming in is restricted, which means that by default, traffic is not allowed inside, but outside it is allowed. So that's what, if you closely observe this default inbound and outbound rules, you will understand that. I'll ask you to spend some time here if you're interested. But what is that it says, right? Who is that, guys? Go on mute. Somebody is disturbing. I'm sorry. Let me mute. Okay, so if you look at these inbound rules, right? The first inbound rule is allow VNet inbound. Okay, so I'm not concentrating on these first two. Let us go to the last one. Okay, they deny. This rule, if I open it, it's not. Okay, so what does it say? Any source, right? Any source, any destination on any port on any protocol by default is what? Deny. But you can write your own rules with a priority higher than this. That's what is happening. When I write a rule with 100, it is overriding this. That's the reason you are allowing that web traffic, right? So that's how it will work actually. Okay. So let us say that this is your NSG that which you created. And if you want to associate this NSG, I just created a group, but I didn't tell to which subnets or network interface cards this particular rule is applicable, or these particular rules should be applied. That's where your association will come into picture. Now, as I said initially, it can be NSJ can be associated to either subnets or it can be associated to your network interface cards. Now, let us say my requirement is to associate this to a web subnet, right? My requirement is to associate to the web subnet that which I just created few minutes back. So let me go back and go to the subnets here. Click on associate. It will ask you a virtual network. Why virtual network? Your subnet will sit in your virtual network, right? So that's the reason you need to go and select your virtual network. So my subnet, web subnet, is part of my production virtual network. And within production virtual network, you may have multiple subnets. Now, and we do have two subnets, right? But this particular NSG is created specifically for my web traffic. And that's the reason I need to go and put or associate to my web subnet where my web servers will reside, right? So I am associating this. So what will happen now? Any traffic which is entering into the web subnet, any traffic which is entering into this web subnet, and this NSG that what you created here will be validating If it is a web traffic from internet on 443 and 80, it will open the door. Otherwise, it will drop the traffic, right? Similarly, you can define multiple rules within one NSG, and the source and destination might be different in each rule. That is also possible, right? So again, there is a limit with the number of rules you can write within an NSG and other stuff. You can refer to the quotas and limits of Azure documentation, where you get detailed information, how many rules I can write within an NSG. Okay. Now, so this is how you can go and create an NSG within a, what do you call it as, to a subnet. Now, I thought of going and spending some time on creating these VMs, and then I think it is too much. It's going to be kind of over. Even if I start doing it, we will not be able to finish it in time. So I'll stop this here. Okay. So I'll stop this here at what you call it as network security group level. If time permits, maybe sometime in the next month, I'll try to have one more webinar continuing what we had seen today. That may help you understand more. Now we understood about the networking part, whatever I need before I go and deploy any resource in my environment, right? The next step would be like go and put those workloads with whether it is web subnet or DB subnet or wherever, and start kind of checking whether the rules that whatever you defined are really being followed or working or not, right? So that will be our actually next uh, concept to understand virtual machine sizes and quick lab on that. But interest of time and the content, so I just thought of stopping here. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. We'll spend 10 minutes or so to kind of interact with each other. So again, I'll try to answer the questions if you have anything, and it doesn't mean that I know everything. I'll try to kind of answer as much as what I mean, to the extent what I know. If I don't know, maybe I have to come back to you, or I'll drop me an email, then I can revert you back. Okay. So thanks for your time. If you have any questions, you can please unmute yourself and ask.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't see your name. I see it as Apo A5. Can you tell your name, please?
Yeah, my name is Reddy. Are you able to hear?
Yeah, I can ready. Go ahead.
So, just I am looking for development training in Azure. Will you provide any online training on development in Azure?
No, mate, I don't provide any development training. I do train people on infrastructure, specifically in the administration, and I'll also going to kind of plan something on architect level as well, but no development.
Okay, okay. So, how can we contact you regarding administration courses and all?
Okay, so here is my email address, vijay@virtualvemla.com. You can drop me a note on that. We can get in touch with you. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Right. So any technical questions from anybody, guys? Any questions? I want to hear.
Hi Vijay.
Hey Nageshwara, go ahead.
Yeah. How can we create DMG network in Azure? Like we have external facing firewall or internal facing firewall. So can we create one NSG and we can use it for both, or we need to create two NSGs?
Right. So most of the time when it comes to what do you call it as DMZ, how it will be is we will create a separate VNet for the DMZ environment. That is a standard practice. Okay. Now that VNet, in front of that VNet, you will have a firewall. Okay. So anything that which is entering into the VNet which is facing to your on-prem or internet will be coming through that firewall. Okay. Now it enters traffic will enter into your VNet, and again you may create subnets with another layer of security if needed with NSG rules, right? So, and if you have any further VNets, they will be at the back end, which in turn communicate with this front end VNet and pass the traffic. That we call it as hub and spoke model. In this model, you will have multiple VNets communicating with each other. Now, to answer your question about the firewall, before your VNet, you will have Azure firewall. Even you can go with other firewall vendors appliances as well. And from how that's how you can drop or restrict the traffic. And on top of that, you can also use some VPN solutions as well, right? Let us say if you are kind of integrating your on-premises to kind of Azure, then you can also use VPN solutions which are available. It has got site-to-site VPN, and of course, Express route is there, and the other VPN solutions are also available. But that's how most of the solutions are. To get what you need, refer this, okay? Azure Architecture Center, okay?
Okay.
Now this Architecture Center has got all those frameworks, okay, designs, standard designs Microsoft recommends for each of the technology, right? So if you look at the networking, what you asked, maybe you'll find it here, right? If you go virtual network gateways or hybrid network, maybe I'll be able to show you this.
Okay.
Right? You see this, right? Now what you're seeing here, you got on-prem, there is a gateway, on cloud, there is a gateway, there is a route you are defining. This is called as static routes. And it is going through a firewall. And this firewall is interacting with your VNet. And within that VNet, you have multiple subnets, right? So like that. So this is how your environment will be. So refer the documentation here. You got very good what you call it as architectural solutions, but it need not be kind of fit for your requirement. Maybe you need to tweak as per your requirement, but it will give an understanding what is the best and secure way of setting up your network infrastructure. Hope that answers your
Yeah.
question.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Okay, so any other questions from anybody?
Vijay,
Yeah, go ahead. Who is this?
this is Dinesh here.
Hey Dinesh. Yeah.
Right. Regarding the VMs hosted on Azure, right? So it should be in the internet the access by default.
It should be
So
what?
the internet access, right, by default.
Okay. Tell me. I'll answer your question. Tell me.
Okay. So if we want to restrict the internet access to the Azure hosted VMs, so how do we do that?
You write an outbound rule, right? So you can always go and write a rule saying that restrict the access. That can be done actually. Maybe
Okay.
I think yeah. So you can write an outbound rule.
In the sense, disabling the outbound default rule, is that?
No, you may have to kind of look at the solution, the rule where you can go and stop only the what you call it as internet, right? So I haven't done it. Maybe I think I have to look into the documentation, but it is possible. It is very much possible. It is very much possible. Yeah, because most of the organizations don't want internet on their machines, right? So we do understand the threat over there, right?
Oh, okay. Thanks. Sir.
Yeah, no problems. Okay, any other questions from anybody, guys? Okay, so if no questions, I think I'm done. The webinar will be uploaded, and I think you will be uploaded into maybe on YouTube. You will get a notification with the link. If you want to share with any of your friends, you can share it, or if you want to go back and listen to it, then you can. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. I'll be checking my emails frequently on the email address that whatever is specified here. Thank you. Thanks for joining. I wish you guys have a great day. I hope you learned at least something out of this session, and hope we'll meet maybe sometime next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Thanks, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you.
Thank you.